This program is made possible by a grant from Friends of the Library, Maryville, Tennessee.
My great-great-grandfather came in there, and he and his brother-in-law built the first of the large grist mills there, and it started operation in 1831. The church was not a place for frivolity, and that's why weddings were never performed in the church in those days. The fact is, I never knew of a church wedding until I came out of Cades Cove and found out that some people did practice it. I can go in there and completely block out everything that's there except there's that house sitting up there and here, and there's Aunt Becky sitting on the porch, and everything. It's just memories that are too precious to describe. It's hard to verbalize them.
This is Foothills Profile, featuring individuals whose lives have made a special contribution to the history of Blount County, Tennessee. This month, Nina Megginson talks with Dr. Randolph Shields, retired Maryville College professor and authority on the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Cades Cove.
Today I'm visiting with Dr. Randolph Shields, native of Cades Cove and author of the Cades Cove story. Although there's no full agreement on how Cades Cove got its name, do you have some speculations about that?
There are about 3 or 4 at least. One is that the wife of the Chief Abram of the Cherokee Nation had a very unpronounceable name, and the earlier settlers called her Kate. And she claimed that that was her territory over there, and so they just called it Cades Cove. And it finally got spelled with a D instead of a T. Another is that it was named for a minor chief of the Cherokees, who was K-A-D-E-S, or Cades. And my personal opinion is it probably was named by the engineers from the state of North Carolina that first surveyed the Hiwassee district into sections and townships, because the name appears in the 1790s in North Carolina land grant information. But whether Cades was one of the engineers or somebody, I don't know. Really, there's no absolute evidence as to how it got its name.
What can you tell me about the natural phenomena of the area of Cades Cove and its development?
Cades Cove is called a window by the geology terms. It is an eroded area through older materials into young materials, and opens up a window, in other words. The mountains of the Smokies, and well, the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, are the result of the continental drift concepts, at least. This is the theory. About 400 million years ago or so, when the continental masses slammed together and the North American mass slammed into the African mass, it pushed up the coastal areas of that time, folded up and pushed it northwestward some 300 miles now, they think, and shoved the coastal plain rocks, or what became the rocks at least, up over the limestones that was on the floors of the inland seas at that time. And then with time and the buckling of this process and erosion that was taking places in those buckles, the younger rocks were exposed. The limestone rocks were exposed, and that forms the floor of Cades Cove, as well as Tuckaleechee Cove and Miller's Cove and Ware's Cove in the area. So it has a very long history.
When did Cades Cove actually begin to develop as a community?
The community started in 1821 when the state granted Fighting Billy Tipton about 3 sections of land in there, and then he started selling it off to his relatives and neighbors from upper East Tennessee. It was still in Indian territory until 1819, and of course Tuckaleechee Cove nearby was settled in the 1790s, but it wasn't until after the Indians had ceded the land in the Hiwassee district that Cades Cove settlement was possible.
What was the terrain like when it first began, and what were the accesses to the cove?
Well, Cades Cove is what you might speak of as a cavity, I suppose, lying within the mountains. It's completely surrounded with mountains with an outlet on the western end. And separating Cades Cove from Tuckaleechee Valley is a mountain range, Cades Cove Mountain, commonly called the Rich Mountain Range. The access was to Cades Cove from Tuckaleechee was an Indian trace. Now, the Indian Nation lay primarily south and west of Cades Cove in North Carolina and along the Little Tennessee River. And there were Indian roads from North Carolina by way of Econeatley Gap into Cades Cove, and from the Little Tennessee River by way of Sam's Gap and through the western end. Those two trails met in the cove, and then out across the Cades Cove and Rich Mountains into Tuckaleechee Valley. Now, those were the access Indian roads. And the early settlers went into Cades Cove, followed the one from Tuckaleechee Cove. And it was the main access in until after 1835, when they built a new road across the mountain.
What was the home life like when the families first began to build and grow in Cades Cove?
Well, of course, the first families that entered to Cades Cove had to clear their land. And in the process of the land clearing, of course, they built their cabins, as was true in the entire frontier, pioneering frontier of the time here in the southern Appalachians. And they cleared their land, built their cabins, and got a garden patch going as quick as they could, of course, to raise the food they would need. Then they continued to clear and build then their outbuildings, their barns, and so forth, and plant their pastures and whatever was necessary for the other crops. But it was rough, and most of the families were fairly young families that came in, and they some had a few children, but most of them were young married couples that came in and got started and raised their families there. And so at first, I suppose, there wasn't a large family to feed, and the gardener would take care of things pretty well until they got started and got their families underway.
What about the farming as far as the cattle and hogs and those types of things?
Well, of course, I have an idea that they all brought at least a cow along with them, because milk was very essential in those days, and maybe a pig or two, and to get started with their meat supply. Of course, meat supply was pretty plentiful in those days in the forest, because the area was used rather extensively by the Cherokee Indians as a hunting area. It never was used as a residential area or farming area for them, but it was a hunting ground, part of the Cherokees from the Little Tennessee River. And then, of course, as soon as they got their row crops in, the corn was one of the first things they grew plenty of, because it was the principal food staple. And first, I suppose, they pounded up with mortar and pestles, but then they finally, with the many streams, began to construct small grist mills, the tub mill type, and then within a few years, of course, by 1830, my great-great-grandfather came in there, and he and his brother-in-law built the first of the large grist mills there, and it started operation in 1831.
Where was your family home located, and what were some of the chores that you experienced when you were a boy?
I grew up in the western end of the cove, which was just up the road about half a mile from the Park Visitor Center there at the cable mill. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we had a grist mill, and that was the central part of, at least, of our farm and so forth. We didn't have to raise an awful lot of corn except for food, because we got all of our bread meal and stuff from toll from grinding the corn for other people. And it was my grandmother's job to operate the mill. My grandfather died in 1902, leaving with her with 6 rather small children, and she just took over the operation of the farm and the mill and everything else. And of course, growing up, we kids had all of our chores. As soon as we got big enough, we were carrying water to people working in the fields or whatever was necessary to maybe to keep us busy as much as anything else. But as soon as we got to the place where we could carry in wood, do whatever, we all had chores. Running to the pasture after the cows or whatever it was, we had to work all the time.
What were some of the big social events in Cades Cove?
Well, the social activity, we might back up just a moment and say that leisure time, of course, was a precious sort of thing, because very few people had them, but ever occasionally there were events that permitted groups to get together, and these associated with harvest time, a lot of them were, with the, well, I guess it might start in the late fall when they were picking the gooseberries, and they'd harvest those and until they got quite a few, and then the stems had to be pulled off of those individually. Every berry had to be picked up and the stem pulled off of it. And so they made a social event of that. Families would get together and exchange their gossip, and the kids would play. And of course, the kids were picking stems off of berries as well as everybody else, but everybody was enjoying it. And when they got through, they usually had a little social cider or whatever was available, and some cookies or whatever. And other events were related to the church in a way. That is, the church was not a place for frivolity, and that's why weddings were never performed in the church in those days. The fact is, I never knew of a church wedding until I came out of Cades Cove and found out that some people did practice it, but of course it's a lot different. A wedding in Cades Cove was a time of a lot of happiness and frivolity and passing a bottle around, maybe, things of that nature, a little music playing and some dancing. That all took place in the homes, and it was a great time. And the groom could expect, at least, after everything quieted down, well, all of a sudden a bunch of his friends would make a raid on the house and drag him out and put him astraddle the rail and ride him around the house a time or two and things of that nature. It was just a great time. With the schools, there was the speakings, as they were called, where usually on Saturday or Friday afternoons, every once in a while, they would have programs where the kids would put on skits, and they might have a spelling bee, or the members of the community would participate a great deal in those. I can remember my great-uncle John McCauley was in big demand for those types of things. He was a good ballad singer and a banjo picker, and those type of events were always enjoyed by everybody.
Religion must have been very prevalent in the early lives of the Cades Cove people, in evidenced by the churches that are still present there. What were some of the reasons for the community beginning to add congregations?
I suppose revivals as much as anything else, but the competition, of course, for membership among the churches, I think, was not very great. As far as the records go, I think the Methodists were the first to hold meetings, and it became a regular member of the Little River Circuit back in the very early days. The Baptists, of course, were more prominent, and the main leaders of the Cove were Baptists at that time. And we must remember now that was before the day of the primitive Baptists. They were just the Tennessee Baptist Association, the Baptists. And they had their first organizational meeting in 1827, and then in 1829 they were admitted into the Tennessee Association of Baptists. But they, in about 1838, split up over the missionary question. There were some in the church that wanted to support the mission work, and others didn't think that that was a part of their business. And so they had a parting of the ways. 13 of the members pulled out. Well, the word is that they were kicked out. and organized a church of their own, which then became known as the Missionary Baptist Church. That left the Old Baptists, as they become known as after that, the Primitive Baptists, or Hard-Shell Baptists. They were very fundamental in their beliefs and their practices. They were the foot-washing Baptists. And throughout, I suppose, the existence of the Cove, that church had the largest membership of either of them. The Methodists never did get very large. Usually there's about 4 families that maintain the Methodist church, primarily the Fiesels, and they donated land for the church. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, that, and I have in my possession a copy of the church records from 1856 until 1906, and which is kept by one of the Fiesel families. And the recorders, they listed, and there never was, I think, in thinking back over the list, more than about 20 members in the Methodist Church at any time. And when the circuit preachers would come by, they would record the roll at the time, and this went into the book, and make what comments they wanted to make about them. And after the Civil War, of course, then that church split up like the other Methodist church, and they had a meeting at one of the schoolhouses about a year after the war had kind of settled down, and organized a group which they called the Hopewell Methodist Church, which then became associated with the so-called Northern Methodists, and the original church remained as the Methodist Church South, and still with the Fiesels pretty much in. But an interesting thing about that is that Dan Lawson was a member and pretty important guy in the Methodist Church at the time, and that he donated the land for the new church up on the top of the hill above his house, and the lumber for building the church and so forth. But he still remained on the roll of the other Methodist church, and for, well, about 8 years he was listed on the roll of that church. Then he finally dropped and joined the other church. But it's a really, really interesting situation about those people. They didn't take some of it too seriously, I think, as far as the political implications implied with the church.
What do you remember about your education early in Cades Cove, in your home, and attending the schools?
We started school about at 6 years old, like everybody else did, but at that time, when I started school in 1918, they had, well, yeah, by that time the consolidated school was just getting underway. But I went to a one-room school. It was about 2 miles west of where we lived. The fact is, we were about halfway between the school that's called the Laurel Springs School and the consolidated school. But we went out to the consolidated school, and we only had about 3 months of school. The first couple of years I went to school. Usually by Christmas it was over. Then my uncle went up to Johnson City and got qualified to teach, and came back and was principal of the consolidated school. And then we, of course, started going up there, walking that about 2.5 miles every day. We got to be pretty happy when he decided not to go back over there anymore, because he kind of kept things quiet on the way back and forth to school. You know, a lot of kids like to play when they go back and forth to school, and it was a lot of fun. We lived the farthest away, and as we got to the next house, the kids would come out and we'd all get together. By the time we got halfway to school, there'd be 25 or 30 of us, you know, just having a picnic.
What was your favorite subject in school?
Well, I guess arithmetic was about my favorite subject. The fact is, by the time I got to the 4th grade, all my peers, at least, were calling me old arithmetic, because I really loved that subject, and I don't know why I didn't continue that. Maybe it had something to do with me going into the sciences, but anyway, I really loved arithmetic. And spelling, of course, was very important. I mean, for everybody in school at that time. You spelled. And as I see in journals and magazines and so forth today, that spelling is the most vital thing toward really learning to read and learning to think. You got to know the words to think with. And we started out with spelling, very, very, very basic. That is the old method. I guess Elsie Burrell could tell you about the old method of teaching spelling. She did it a lot. But I was fortunate in that our grandmother, who raised us kids, insisted on the books. And although she couldn't read or write her name, she insisted on us studying. And she was a speller. She could spell any word you could pronounce to her. And she could pronounce any word you could spell to her. And so she helped us a lot in our evening homework and figuring out and getting started to read and to spell. And we'd lift up a book. What's that word, Grandma? Spell it. You'd spell it and she'd pronounce it for you, you see. That's the way it worked.
How did the Civil War affect the Cades Cove?
Like it did every place else, I suppose. Of course, the general loyalties of the mountain people were Union. And slavery was never a question, although people lived in Cades Cove with slaves. There were at least 2 families in 1850 that had slaves in Cades Cove. But the people in general just didn't go along with the Civil War, let's put it that way. But the code divided itself just like every place else, and the church records of the time indicate that. The fact is, no churches met in there for a period of about 3 years because of the Civil War. And the eastern end of the cove, people living in the eastern end of the cove were primarily Unionists. And that's where the so-called Home Guard was established. And it was very strong in Tuckaleechee Valley, the Home Guard was. The Union sympathizers that were protecting the people from the raiding rebels, or most of them were not actually associated with the Confederacy. Those raiding parties that went through the mountains were by other people were associated with the rebels, and they tend to sometimes claim they were associated with them, but most of them were just scalawags or small groups of people just out to marauder and capture what they could from the people, horses, and a lot of them would round up horses and go sell them to the army and things of that nature, steal the horses. But there was a great deal of contention between the families. Actually, there were only about 3 families in Cades Cove that were Confederates and had people in the Confederacy. The Feazell family was one pretty good-sized family that had members of the family in the Confederacy, and Daniel Fout's family. And Daniel Fout was a pretty big leader in the Cove. He had gathered him up a lot of land through foreclosing on mortgages and things of that nature, and was a much hated man, I should say, by most of the people in the Cove, primarily for that reason, if nothing else. But as soon as the Union Army become dominant in this particular area, after they captured Knoxville and others, why, it was pretty obvious the way things were going. Daniel Fout was taken by the Home Guard people in Cades Cove to Knoxville and put in the federal prison over there as a rebel, and his daughter asked them to parole him at least up to her house. She could take care of him. Actually, they hauled him out of his sick bed in Cades Cove, and he died about a week after they took him out of prison into her home. But bitterness, I don't think stayed on too long. In other words, after the war, people seemed to get back together. Churches started meeting again, and the Methodists separated. The Baptists, it never was a problem, I don't think. But the Baptist records, at least, they indicate that other people other than other Baptists were after them. I don't know exactly who it was. I have my suspicions, but I guess I can't express them. But they remarked that their pastor or elder had been marked for death to that extent, and he couldn't show himself, and therefore they couldn't have meetings and things of that nature.
The last section of your book, The Cades Cove Story, is soaking in the mountains. As you return and visit Cades Cove as it is now, what are your thoughts and your visualizations as you look at that land and how it was then and how it's changed to what it is now?
Now this is one of the most difficult things, I think, to verbalize. It's you can, unless you have something to experience that will be in something in the same line. Of course, when I go back to now, I do as as often as I can. Of course, as you say, visualize the situation as it was. I was growing up as a boy, and I can see myself as a boy, and all my cousins and relatives and the people that around. I can see my grandmother and my aunt that raised us, and the condition as one. I think to make the point, I go back to a situation that happens to me every once in a while now. One of my ex-students from Maryville College is involved in an outdoor school project from up in New England, which takes high school age kids in a specialized bus around the eastern part of the United States during the school year, holding classes and various things everywhere around and having area people in. And the last 3 years I have spent 2 days with them in Cades Cove. And they're kids from cities up in New England and so forth. And this spring we were there when the jonquils were all in bloom. In Cades Cove, every household had jonquils. And if you don't know where the old houses were, go in there when the jonquils are in bloom. There they are. And there were, just plenty of them. And after they left, and about 2 weeks ago, I got a letter back from one of those students and expressing his gratitude to the experience in Cades Cove. And he said the thing that impressed him most was that while I was pointing out the jonquils to the people, he realized that I was seeing the houses and the people who were there, and all they could see were jonquils. And this is what it means, that I can go in there and completely block out everything that's there, except there's that house sitting up there, and here, and there's Aunt Becky sitting on the porch, and everything. It's just memories that are too precious to describe. It's hard to verbalize them.
Thank you so much for sharing your memories and some of the history of Cades Cove with the present and future citizens of Blount County, Tennessee.
Thank you.
Foothills Profile, featuring individuals whose lives have made a special contribution to the history of Blount County, Tennessee. This month's profile has featured Dr. Randolph Shields, retired chairman of the Biology Department of Maryville College and authority on Cades Cove and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This has been a production of WFBA Television, Alcoa. This program has been made possible by a grant from Friends of the Library, Maryville, Tennessee.